Ashley Ekins, congratulations on finishing the book and thanks so much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Scott.
Now, for a conflict where Australia's combat involvement effectively ended 40 years ago, why has it taken until now for this final volume of the official history to come out?
Scott, that's a question many people have asked, and official histories are long involved projects. They always have been. I might add the US Army is still to complete its own official history series, and just recently the Chief of History with the US Army made the point that these histories take 8 to 9 years each in the writing, the research and the writing. That's pretty much the average for the Australian experience too. I might say my distinguished predecessor, the first of our official historians, Charles Bean, who wrote that massive, monumental 12-volume history of the First World War, set out thinking he could write all of that in 5 years. It took him 23. And Bean had to, throughout the 20s and the 30s, constantly explain why it was such a long job and why it was taking so long. He even had the Auditor General on his tail who wanted to scuttle the whole process at one stage and terminate the history because it was costing too much, he thought, and was too detailed and wouldn't be read. Well, how wrong he was. Indeed.
Now, you feel that this era of Australia's involvement in Vietnam from 1968 through to 75 has been largely overlooked. Why is that?
Scott, it's because I think the Tet Offensive was seen as the pivotal turning point in the war. That's not quite true, but it's how it's viewed. And a change did come in the war, and the Americans began to draw down forces and withdraw. And much of what happened after Tet, in many popular accounts and certainly in popular memory, is often seen just as a postscript to the war up to that stage. Whereas in fact for the Australians this was the peak period of our commitment. We had a force of 6,000 troops constantly involved during those years, 3.5 years of operations. We only drew them down in the last 18 months, but it was a major force, a major commitment. 11 infantry battalions rotated through with all their supporting arms, armour, cavalry, engineers and so on. A really major sense of commitment with 100 major operations. And of course it's in this period that over half of the soldiers who die in Vietnam actually do die.
That was some 250.
Indeed.
If we can look at a couple of the issues that you write about, the issues that are entwined with the operations during this period that you've written about, defoliation and mines. Let's look at mines first. I was staggered by the percentage of Australian casualties attributed to mines, including those caused by mines that were originally laid by Australian forces in this massive minefield barrier that were then dug up and used against our own forces by the Viet Cong. It's an extraordinary percentage and an extraordinary tale of the Vietnam War.
Yes, it is. It's an extraordinary tale on both sides. The fact that the Viet Cong had the tenacity and determination and ingenuity to actually work out a way of deactivating these mines. 23,000 were laid in an 11-kilometre strip. Many have called it the biggest blunder of the Australian part of the war. And certainly thousands of them were lifted. We'll never know exactly how many, and redeployed against the Australians. And it's for the first time the figures are actually calculated in this volume. And we estimate that of all the mine casualties, probably half were due to our own mines. Whether they came from that minefield or whether they were stolen or used in other ways, we don't know. But they're the figures, and mines really contributed about 1/5 of the total fatalities in Vietnam, and of course caused endless suffering with the maiming and wounding and injuring of men.
Ashley, what did that do to the psychology, to the morale of the blokes when they realised that the equipment that was causing so much damage to their own was in fact their own equipment that they'd laid?
It had a disastrous effect on morale. How soldiers kept fighting is almost miraculous, because men on patrol might feel that every step could be a step on one of these mines or in some form of booby trap or mine. And of course these things had come from, many of them had come from our own minefield. So obviously that had a toll too, the long-term effect of that. The soldiers, with typical diggers' humour, referred to the minefield itself as the VC mine store. Typical digger black humour, but they still had to cope with this thing on a daily basis. And the mines themselves, these M16 mines that jumped to about waist height before they detonated, caused unbelievable havoc. They could kill 2 or 3 men and wound up to 20 or 30 just with one explosion. And the Viet Cong were cunning enough to know how to lay these things in groups. They never just laid one mine, so that in many incidents, like the famous one on the 21st of July 1969, the day mankind landed on the moon, the Americans landed on the moon, one mine went off, killed and wounded a large number of men, and of course as rescuers came in, they detonated another mine, and more were killed and wounded.
On that other issue I raised, forest clearing and defoliation by chemicals, once again I was staggered by that figure in your book. About 20% of South Vietnam was sprayed or affected by this. What conclusions did you arrive at about this method, of its strategic effectiveness and its ongoing physical and psychological effects on both veterans and the Vietnamese people?
We're still measuring the latter, of course. We don't know. Clearly it had tremendous ecological and biological damage in Vietnam, and that's ongoing. The effect on the troops, again, we're still measuring, and the consequences might still be long-term. But as far as the strategy went, the first part of your question, already within a year or two of the beginning of this massive American Operation Ranch Hand, spraying herbicides across vast tracts of jungle and crops, trying to restrict and limit the Viet Cong, they knew already that that was having almost an adverse effect. For villagers who had their crops destroyed, this almost turned them into the hands of the Viet Cong.
More than any other time in our history, Ashley, this was a war being fought at home as well, with the opposition to conscription, to Australia even being in Vietnam. How much did the war on the home front shape government policies and perceptions even among the troops in the field?
I think both. It shaped government policies because each successive task force commander was asked on going to Vietnam to try and limit casualties. They knew that the political effects of high casualties would be a millstone for the government. So particularly with the issue of conscription, with selective conscription of young 20-year-olds trained up and sent to fight in Vietnam. And for much of the war, most of the units consisted of at least a third and often half national servicemen. So that part of it was certainly diabolically counter to the government's aims. With the whole issue of conscription, though, and commitment to Vietnam with a divided society at home, I think the soldiers began to feel increasingly a sense of alienation. The home front society was in tumult. There was great division. By 1969, the middle of 1969, this book records that the tipping point came really with popular opinion at home, at very much the same point as Australian forces in Vietnam reached their peak. And yet to the soldiers this seemed very distant to their experience, and they felt that the people on the home front had no regard or understanding for what they were going through.
With the benefit of hindsight, with the years that have gone between, what answer have you arrived at to the very question that was posed even before the war had ended? What was the worth of the Australian contribution in Vietnam?
Indeed, I think in my reflections, in my assessment, I go back to that initial question too, and back to the opportunity we had in 1965 when the Menzies government first committed troops on the 29th of April 1965. It was done on the basis of the most limited amount of intelligence and knowledge, very little assessment of what would be entailed in the war, what the cost would be, what the cost of victory might be, whether it was achievable, and indeed how we would even measure success. How would we know we'd achieved our aims? So there was no real exit strategy. It was an open-ended commitment, and I think the Americans were in the same situation, as I point out. They had not thought these issues through clearly either.
Finally, and perhaps further to that, from your pages, like in all good histories, the past often seems to echo into the present. And some of what was happening for Australia in Vietnam, militarily and politically, seems to have similarities to what's being played out in Afghanistan. And I was wondering how often and how profoundly did those parallels strike you as you were writing this book?
I tried to avoid the parallels as much as possible. I mean, sometimes it's almost impossible. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And there are actually times when you can see this. In Vietnam, we were training up forces. We were trying to defeat an insurgent force and training the local forces so that they could take over the role. Our soldiers performed an outstanding job, but they began to grow more and more cynical that this was not going to be safe once they left. Phuoc Tuy, the province they mostly operated in, was said to be left pacified when they left, but it only took a few months before it reverted back into anarchy and chaos. And I think many soldiers saw the writing on the wall. Whether that can be extrapolated into the Afghan situation, I leave for others to decide. But certainly there are many lessons to be drawn from the Vietnam experience.
And are we, as a nation, learning those?
I certainly hope so. I hope that young soldiers in particular will read this book. Young officers and commanders have much to learn about the way things can be done well, the things that fail and the things that really should be reconsidered.
Ashley Ekins, congratulations on finishing Fighting to the Finish, and thanks very much for talking with us tonight.
Thank you, Scott.